fellow dog nerds. Welcome to Farfetched, the podcast where we debunk common dog myths and share the truth about humans' best friend. I'm Crystal Dunn, writer, trainer, activist, dog behavior nerd, puppy enthusiast, whatever. With me today, I have special guest, Cara Sue Achterberg. She's a longtime volunteer foster and author of numerous dog memoirs. Her book, Another Good Dog, talks about her experiences while fostering over 50 dogs with her family. And her book, 100 Dogs and Counting, chronicles her visits to numerous shelters in the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Alabama, to name a few. Cara, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you. This is a really important conversation. Aptly, today we are talking about the current state of shelters in the U.S., and I'm really happy to have your insight.
Great.
All right. Well, let's, excuse me, let's jump in. One of my favorite things about your book, actually, 100 Dogs and Counting, which is the one I've recently read, is how it shows the challenges of straddling two worlds at once. Like this book tour that you're on, filled with friends and fans, arguably an enjoyable experience, contrasted with the brutal realities of our shelter system, where you're meeting dogs in cages and the people that care for them day in and day out. One case in an actual dump.
Yeah.
So this is a struggle that a lot of animal care workers deal with every day, though, and it proved to be quite the emotional roller coaster that you took yourself on. How did this road trip impact the way that you see the homeless pet issue in the U.S. compared to how you saw it before?
Oh my gosh, it changed everything for me, because prior to taking that trip, the first trip, which was to support my book, Another Good Dog, which was about the first 50 foster dogs. At that point, I had fostered over 100 dogs by the time I was heading off, or close to. I guess it wasn't quite 100. But I thought I knew what I was going to see. I thought we were going to roll into town with our donations. We had a van stuffed with donated stuff, and we were going to unload it, and we were going to meet all the happy people and the happy dogs, and then we were going to roll on to the next town and do the book signing, and then, go to the shelter. And that is not, that's not how it played out, because I was just shocked. I just did not realize, I think a couple of things that I didn't realize. One, how full the shelters were, and two, the conditions that the dogs were living in. Those kind of things really, really shocked me and changed everything for me. And my life's definitely not been the same. Fostering's not been the same. Nothing's been the same since meeting those people and seeing all those shelters.
How did it change fostering for you?
I have more of an urgency, I think, and I felt more compelled to foster larger dogs, because I know those are the dogs dying in the shelters, and to foster dogs that have any kind of bully breeding. Mm-hmm. Because I know those are also the dogs that are the first to die in a shelter. And so that definitely, before that I was always looking for the cute one who spoke to me in the picture, and now it was more like, which dog is least likely to make it out the front door of that shelter? That's the one I want to foster.
Yeah, that's a great point too. It's funny, I didn't start out being a pit bull advocate myself. Like I never really thought much about it, honestly. When I went to go adopt my first dogs, many years ago, I just was the same way. I picked the one that I felt like needed out of the shelter, but I wasn't really looking at all those factors. And then the more and more I got into dogs, the more I realized the plight of pit bulls and black dogs and big dogs and dogs with any kind of special needs. And that's really what pulled me into pit bull advocacy. It wasn't even really a big love for the breed at first. I fell in love with the breed as I worked with them more and more. It was really just about like taking care of the problem, like dealing with the underdog issue here. Right. And I felt like my particular behavior services could be best helped in that breed family. So it's funny because people always make jokes with me about how, like, oh, well, Crystal, her, she only loves pit bulls. I'm like, actually, I kind of love all the dogs. Like, I'd probably have like a Pomeranian on my lap right now if I hadn't gotten so involved in the pit bull world. But I mean, I absolutely do love pit bulls, as you can see behind me laying on the bed. There are two of them sleeping on each other. But yeah, it's an eye-opening thing, isn't it? Just going in there.
My husband's always like, when are we going to get to have the dog that doesn't have a problem? The dog that like, the easy dog. But once you go down there and you see this, you can't unsee it.
Well, and there's something special about them too, like, I've told my husband the same thing. That's not our lot in life. We
Right.
don't get the dogs with no problems. Actually, we got lucky. We do have dogs with fairly few problems, if any. But they were also dogs that nobody else wanted, and it was
Right.
like, that was one thing that I do a lot for Lovable, is I help them pick dogs that are very behaviorally sound to pull into our program. But we'll talk about that process a little bit later too, because that's kind of that's a problem all in itself, that we have to do that, right?
Right.
We shouldn't have to pick. So it's important to keep this conversation about our homeless pet population going on these days for a variety of reasons. There's a lot of misconceptions about how successful the animal rescue world is right now, because thanks to the internet, we're seeing a lot more heartwarming rescue stories these days, which is great. And we're even seeing some empty shelters. At the beginning of the pandemic, especially, we saw a lot of this with foster and adoption numbers skyrocketing. So up north, in some states, we're seeing much lower instances of pet homelessness or in general, much lower instances of that, and it's creating some demand even for bringing dogs up from the south. So, when you see that, and you see the videos of all the empty kennels, and you see the shelter workers cheering and stuff like that, you might be tempted to think that we're almost there, and you see all the dodo videos, I mean, I too love seeing the dog, the two-legged dog get his first wheelchair. It's heartwarming, and I'm there for it. But it's not really the reality of our situation right now. And I think it's really important that we continue talking about that reality, because even as the pandemic continues, we're getting a lot of those dogs back. Where a lot of people had to go back to work. They're not fostering as much anymore. A lot of people, when they went back to work, they discovered issues with their adopted dogs, like separation anxiety and other issues that they weren't willing to deal with. And so even the pandemic, as much as that illustrated how effective we could be if mass numbers of people show up to help out, we get empty shelters. We also know that people aren't necessarily thinking it through entirely either. So it's still a big issue. So you took a tour through a lot of the South and saw a lot of shelters. What were the conditions like at some of the shelters that you visited on your road trip, Cara?
They varied so much. I have like a general impression of each state, but then um, most of them are, and I say most, I've been to 50, and there are thousands, if not tens of thousands, but many or most are dogs in cement bunkers, I would call them. They're like usually cement walls and cement floors. In the front will be chain link. And in a decent shelter, they will have a raised bed of some kind so that they're not laying in their own feces. And in a really good shelter, they might have a Kong or some kind of indestructible toy. And but they were pretty tough to see these dogs. Just knowing, my own dogs and like how busy they are during the day and how they need interaction and they need us to do stuff. To see these dogs, especially in, for instance, like a stray hold of a public shelter. A stray hold means that they have to be held for at least usually 3 days, sometimes 5, even 7 days legally until they can be put available for adoption or pulled by rescue. And for those days, many times these dogs are in the worst place in the facility. They're in like this a cement bunker, and they have nothing to do, and they have no bed, and they have no interaction, and they are not handled very much, except for maybe if they're hopefully taken out of their kennel while they clean the kennel. A lot of times they're not taken out of the kennel while they clean their kennel, which is
I hate that
cruel
so
when they
much.
use those high pressure hoses and dogs are in the kennel.
It's
But that's a
disgusting.
really stressful, sad place for a dog to be. And then at the end of that time, we're suddenly going to throw them out in the public area to make them adoptable. And you think
Set them
about
up
their
for
psyche at that
success.
point. Yeah, what they've been through. So I don't know, the conditions ran the gamut. And then I did see places where they had a great volunteer program and there were volunteers coming in and out and walking the dogs and teaching them to sit before they go in and out, and um, really, really good stuff. And then I also saw places, particularly in the dog pounds, the Missouri and Tennessee have dog pound system, um, where the dogs are all alone in these cement buildings with no heat, no air conditioning, and laying in their own feces, and they're just held there until they're claimed. And when they're not claimed, which most of them are not, then they're killed. And that to me was a shock to know that's going on right now in our country
Yeah,
every
it's
day.
almost like we set them up to fail,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're surprised when they don't succeed, which is
Right.
it's maddening. Um, yeah, you know, and it's important to keep in mind that we've been mass murdering dogs and cats in this country for a very long time, right? Like, while those numbers are on the decline, and we have made some progress, they're still like really bad. This isn't to undermine the success that we have, you know, seen so far, because that success is hard earned. Saving so many lives can be directly attributed to the perseverance of some of the most dedicated people on the planet, many of which have never earned a dime doing it,
Mm-hmm.
and many more of which have spent money doing it. So the animal world's rich with selfless, determined people who have scrubbed shit and put up with humanity's shit for far too long, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
And they're tired, you know. They're also scared that people might think that some progress is enough progress. You know, I've seen this happen recently with the Austin City Council, where one council member opposed additional funding for the shelter, saying that the large facility in the nation's biggest no-kill city is good enough. And it's true, our shelter is very nice compared to a lot of the ones that you saw. You know, if you come to Austin and you tour the Austin City shelter, it's huge, and it's, you know, by all accounts, like state of the art compared to your average shelter. But what are we comparing it to? You know, these shelters that you're describing, where dogs are being hosed down in the kennel while they're cleaning the kennel, like, it's ridiculous. Um, and so this particular city council member was opposed to additional funding for the shelter because the large facility, you know, he says is good enough. But the additional funds would have gone to providing temperature control to some outdoor kennels, and a much needed improvement in a city that like easily reaches temperatures over 100 degrees during the summer months and freezes during the winter. So, you know, yeah, compared to the old city shelter, now inhabited by Austin Pets Alive, that's known for flooding, and all the kennels are outside. By contrast, yeah, it looks a lot better, but that doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's good enough. Dogs still, they deserve temperature control, right? Like, it's not like they were asking for a luxury, you know? And you'd think that, you know, we were, you know, setting him a place at the dinner table, the way he kind of talked about it. And it's just kind of maddening because, you know, the city of Austin loves to brag about its 98% shelter survival rate, you know, which is the highest in the nation. And
That's an
we're
incredible number,
the
especially in
biggest no
Texas.
kill. Yeah, especially in Texas, right? And we're the biggest no
Yeah.
kill city in the States, which is definitely, you know, garner some bragging rights. But our shelter workers are becoming more and more disenfranchised by seeing animals suffer in cages. So the turnover in these places is terrible. They can't keep staff, let alone volunteers.
Right.
And the shelters are just rife with drama. So it's a problem. You know, even here with those numbers, it's a problem. So then you compare that to like your more rural shelters where the funds are even lesser, and you've got, you know, these places that aren't taking the animals out of their cages at all during the day. But you also have that situation even in some no-kill type situations, because there's just too many animals to get out of the cages, and there's just not enough people. So, and there's guys like that dude on city council who doesn't want to cough up any more cash. So, because it's supposed to be good enough. So obviously we want to embrace the good stories and, you know, hold on to hope, but we also like need to look at this very realistically and realize that we still have a really long way to go. And, you know, once we actually resolve the homeless pet issue, then when we can talk about good enough. Excuse me, my allergies are killing me today.
Oh.
Just gonna edit that out. So how far do we have to go before we've resolved the homeless pet issue? Is there an end in sight? What's it going to take? What does that bright future of animal sheltering look like? Because I do believe there's a potential for a bright future, right? We just need a plan that involves more, you know, funding and less of a dismissive, no kill will take care of everything approach.
I think we
So
need more than just funding, though. I really think we need leadership. I think
absolutely.
that's more important than funding is leadership. At least from what I saw, shelter by shelter, I could go into shelters that have very small budgets, but phenomenal leaders, and they're saving
Uh-huh.
every dog they can save.
Uh-huh.
And then go into another shelter that has $1 million budget. I know one in Tennessee that has an over, I think it's $1.2 million budget. They take in over 10,000 animals a year, and they have and they place maybe 2,000. So doing the math on that, that's a horrendous number, and it's a shameful number, and it shouldn't be happening. And but the director of that shelter said to me, "Nothing I can do. This is just what She just was throw her hands up like this is it. There's nothing I can do. It's because of the public. They just dump their animals. We're open intake, and so we're the only open intake for 100-mile radius. So people bring their dogs and cats from and all other kinds of creatures from everywhere."
Uh-huh.
And they just kill things on intake. They don't even make the attempt. They don't have a strong volunteer program, if not much at all. They don't have any foster program really, and they don't work with rescue. So
Uh-huh.
all of those things, volunteers, fosters, and working with rescues don't cost very much money, but you need a leader who sees the value and wants to utilize those things. And so it didn't come down to budget, at least in that situation. So in some places it is money, but in a lot of places it's leadership.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we over rely on volunteer aid in this country as well, too. The idea that we, aren't paying the majority of our animal care workers anything at all. If anything, we're costing them money is a bit
Mhm.
absurd with us being the wealthiest country on the planet. You'd think that would be a priority here, but it's not, so we are dealing with it. But you're absolutely right. The leadership issue is key because man, you got a bad director over a shelter and everybody suffers, humans and dogs alike, and
Mhm.
cats and all the other woodland creatures that come in. Rabbits and pigs usually.
Mhm.
So yeah, first let's talk numbers. Let's cover kind of what the current homeless pet stats look like, at least the ones that we have, and how many we're adopting out versus how many we're killing, according to the reported numbers. And that's going to be key in this because
Right.
it seems like a simple question, right? Like you should be able to answer what exactly those numbers are, right? How many homeless animals did we take in last year? How many did we kill? Those are pretty straightforward. But it turns out not so much. There is no formal institution tasked with tracking, tabulating these numbers. So reporting them is not required in the US, so organizations can opt in or out. Do you think all the shelters on your tour were opting in?
Very, very few, except for the state of North Carolina, where it's required by law that they
Yes.
give up those numbers. And so I keep harping on this because they're listed as in the top 5 for states that are killing animals in this country. And having traveled to so many other states where I saw firsthand that they were killing many more animals than they are in North Carolina, it's an unfair. Not that North Carolina is definitely killing their share of animals that they shouldn't be killing, but not more than so many other states. It's just that they have to report their numbers. Whereas I went to, like, for instance, Mississippi doesn't really even have a shelter system. It's just a mishmash of nonprofits and who knows what, and nothing really formal. And so nobody's really reporting those numbers. So they get a pass because
Because they don't
no one's
have to.
reporting
They don't have
them.
to
Then
own
we
it.
don't know that they're killing them, right? So
Yeah.
and it's just astounding to me that's just the way it is. And when I ask a lot of these places, especially some of the really good ones, I've said to them, do you give your numbers to the Humane Society or best friends and no, I mean, some of them don't even have internet access. So like, they're
Yeah.
definitely not reporting their numbers.
Well, and
So,
that doesn't even factor in the teeny tiny rescues too, many of which are run
right,
by like one or two people, right? And don't
right.
even know that they should be reporting their numbers. Some of them aren't even in nonprofit status yet, or may never be at nonprofit status.
Right.
And so you've got a lot more of that. And then of course you've got the areas of the country that don't even bother taking their animals into shelter. They just kill them on site. So
Right.
I know you saw that on your
Did.
road trip as well. So, yeah, so these numbers that we actually have are extremely skewed because of these reasons, right? And shelters have a number of reasons why they might not want to report numbers. And if it's an option, it's just one less, or it's just one less thing they have to do for a lot of them. And then for others, they are intentionally being, secretive about it. And then you've even got, some question as to whether these are even legitimate numbers that are being reported, because, if you are reporting your numbers as a no-kill organization, especially, but it's any organization, that could open you up for some funding, and so there is an incentive to make sure that your numbers appear a certain way. And there's a number of ways that sheltering and rescue organizations might work those numbers to their advantage. So again, and I'm not saying that that's true for all by any stretch of the imagination. Like, I've been part of many organizations that were entirely honest about their numbers, but it does happen, because it's not like there's a whole army of people that goes in and audits, I mean, we don't even fund our shelters, let alone the guys that go in and check their work. Come on, like, that's a long shot away. So yeah, these are just very, very almost not random numbers, but very low numbers compared to probably what our reality is. Mm-hmm. So with that said, for our purposes today, I'll reference the organization Shelter Animals Count, because when you see data on homeless animals, this is usually where it comes from. And the data is about as good as it gets. Just keep all those other factors in mind, because so in 2019, we saw over 4.1 million gross intakes reported from shelters, rescues, and sanctuaries. We had 3.5 million gross live outcomes. And that can include a number of situations, including transfers to rescues and sanctuaries. So the deaths reached over 581,000. Again, that's like a gross understatement of how many animals we're actually killing. And if you just divide that low number by 365 days in a year, we have approximately 1,591 dogs that are dying every single day. And that's what we will admit to. So I surmise that the number is actually much higher. And I'm sure based on what you've seen, for a fact, it's higher than that. And there's a number of ways that we just get around that. But these are the numbers we have to work from. And even these are just stupid high. It's not going down fast enough, if you ask me. So, even though we have no-kill shelters. So, what the hell is happening with our no-kill movement? Like, I thought they were fixing it all, Cara. What's going on with that?
Well, they have the whole goal of 2025 being no kill, but the problem with no kill is it's just a fuzzy word. And I really struggled with it. And I was in a shelter in South Carolina that is technically a no-kill shelter, but when I brought up or used that word or came up in conversation, the director there, who's phenomenal, and is a veterinarian also, she said, I hate that word, because there's no such thing as a no-kill shelter. Because when you say the word no-kill, the public believes that means that no animals are killed, 0 animals are killed. And that's never going to be the case, because there's always going to be animals where the most humane outcome is to euthanize for medical and sometimes behavioral reasons. And so you really can't ever be a 0, it's never going to be no kill. And so what happens though, if someone, if public finds out you've killed an animal for any reason, suddenly you're a bad guy. And suddenly you're defending yourself. The flip side of that is there's everybody trying to, directors want to be no kill so that they get a good, rating and people like them and want to help the shelter. So things happen, not everywhere, obviously, but things happen that shouldn't happen, like defining that yourself, because there isn't a real true definition. So if you say that we brought in 10 dogs and but they were not adoptable, they don't count in our numbers. So what's the term adoptable mean? So the term adoptable to some people or not adoptable to some people would be a pit bull. Like a pit bull is not adoptable in certain places. There's counties where there are not legal, first of all. So
Mm-hmm.
so does that dog count your no kill count? Like if you killed this dog because it's illegal or you didn't believe it could ever be adopted, does that count in your no kill count? I mean, the number, it just gets fuzzier and fuzzier the more you talk about it.
Yeah.
I don't know. But then it's not fair also if you say it's all the dogs that come in, all the animals that come in, um, and you base it on that number. Well, let's say you have some, like I was at another shelter in where was that one? Tennessee, and they had this horrendous virus come in, and it was a highly contagious virus, and all these kittens died of it. Either died or had to be euthanized because they were going to die. So their numbers were huge, right? But it was kittens that were sick with a virus who arrived sick. So do you count
Yeah.
those? But if
There's
you're
no
not
way
going to
to
count
make them.
those, then how do you not count the pit bulls that you don't believe could be adopted? So the number just gets fuzzier and fuzzier and harder to define. And I just hate it. We need a different term.
Yeah, we do. And the technical term, according to Best Friends Animal Society, who's really the society that's made it, very mainstream, this no kill ideology, they define it as saving every dog and cat in a shelter who can be saved. So it means healing the animals who can be healed, treating behaviors that can be treated, and prioritizing safety and high quality of life for both pets and people in our communities. That's literally right off their website. And that sounds really good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But those efforts are relative to the resources available too. So if you're a shelter who has very, very few resources, you have no behavior staff, you have largely volunteer run people like cleaning kennels and walking dogs and stuff like that, they're not training your dogs, they're not doing any kind of rehabilitation, they're not, not unless you get lucky and you've got some that know what they're doing.
Right.
But more often than not, you just have people, straight out of their, straight off the streets, coming in, walking dogs, and that's great. But it's not the same as an organization that can afford to staff a behavior team, or they can afford to staff a veterinary clinic and actually care for the dogs mentally and physically completely, which is much taller order, right? And obviously, it takes a lot more time too, and a lot more space. And then, of
Right.
course, like you said, you've got the numbers coming in, and is this particular shelter, open intake, or are they cherry picking their intakes? Because
Right.
that's also a factor that comes
Oh, that's
into
a
it.
huge factor. We saw that over and over again. The managed intake is the word everyone likes to use at this point. And just like you said, if you cherry pick, if you only take in animals you know will be highly adoptable, then sure, your numbers are going to look great. But what happens to those animals that you don't take in? Do they end up in the open intake shelter 2 counties away? Do they end up dead on the side of the road? What happens to those animals, and who's accountable for that? And so that's all frustrating to me because there's just no clear-cut rule or
Mhm.
definition for any of this, even behavioral analysis. Like there's just no
Oh
assessment. There's
yeah.
no way to make that fair across the board. And
And that's a huge can of worms, because you've
it's
got some
huge.
trainers who feel like they can save every single dog no matter what, which I am strongly opposed to, because
Mhm.
that's just not giving dogs enough credit.
Right.
They're capable of mental illness, they're capable of chemical imbalances, they're complex sentient beings, they're capable of experiencing trauma, and to make the assumption that you can save every single one of them by some magic wand because you're just that good is more of a trainer's ego leading them than it is their actual skill. And those trainers tend to compromise some techniques pretty heavily, and can be extremely violent and abusive. You get into some pretty sketchy areas in there too. So yeah, just even just deciding which dogs are suitable for families and which ones aren't is a very, very difficult question. And you need a lot of expertise and a lot of good brains coming together trying to troubleshoot those issues. And it's just not the reality for so many organizations. And like you said, no kill shelters, they love that marketing tool, but they don't love that word, because you've got this conflicting message that's going out to the public that sets you up to be on the defense. And then you've got, this other part of it. It's like, well, but if we can call our shelter no kill, then people are much more likely to come and volunteer through our doors, because everybody wants to help the no kill shelter. because the no-kill shelters, the ones with the heart of gold, as far as the public is generally concerned, right? They don't necessarily understand that it's based on a statistic that is impacted by a million other factors, and that literally what no-kill actually means is at least a 90% live release rate. And that live release rate can be a lot of different things. And as you mentioned, some of the dogs that come in that are deemed unadoptable from the get-go don't ever make it into that percentage. So you don't necessarily know exactly what you're dealing with there. And you can't really blame the shelters a lot of the time too, because most shelters are doing what they can with the resources that they have. So this is not to make them out to be
Right.
the enemy, just rather to illustrate a very complex problem that people tend to oversimplify based on oversimplified terms.
Right. And then
So
trying to keep those animals sometimes, and trying to maintain the no kill, we warehouse animals.
right.
And that is not a kind thing to do to a dog. But that's a really hard question. Is it better for a dog, especially a dog like a pit bull who's so outgoing in his energy and such a crazy fun mind? Is it better for that dog to be warehoused in a kennel where they don't see daylight, they get a walk once or maybe twice a day for years, or
Mm-hmm.
to euthanize that dog? That's a really hard question, and one that I know shelter directors have to wrestle with. And I would never want to be a shelter director for that reason. I mean, it's just a really hard thing. But if you kill the dog, that's another dog on your, your no kill. So
Yeah.
they end
Well,
up too
and
often being warehoused.
more importantly, it's another dog on your conscience where you're left
Mm,
wondering, could I
right.
have done more? Would that dog have been okay? Now, I pulled a dog from APA a couple years ago for foster. Her name was Mona, and Mona was there off and on for 2 years straight. She was extremely stir crazy in her kennel. She was a little, really sporty black and white pit bull, adorable dog, but just did not present well at all in the kennel because she was running herself ragged in there, just going crazy. And the entire staff I was like, give me your craziest dog that likes to fetch. Because it was for a program that I was working with a toy maker named iFetch. And they wanted to help bring awareness to dogs that were in her situation, long stay dogs. So I was like, I want the sporty dog with the drive to fetch that needs the most help. And they brought me to Mona's kennel. And I brought her out, and she was all over the place. She was spazzy and she couldn't focus. And, I was like, whoa, this is a lot of dog. And it was a little risky even to just like take a ball out of her mouth, because she was so exuberant about it that you could lose a finger in the process, not because of anything aggressive, just because she was a wild woman. And, and we worked with her, and I ended up fostering her. And she was, by all accounts, dog aggressive when I brought her in. They told me that she shouldn't be adopted out with kids, shouldn't be adopted out with dogs, shouldn't be adopted out with cats. I have all those things at my house. So, so I brought her in my house, and I took it slow with her, kept her separate at first and worked with her and everything. And I'll be damned if that dog didn't turn around in about a week's time. She was out with a drag leash around everybody in my house, cats, dogs, child, everybody, not unattended. But about 2 weeks in, I was like, man, you're downright almost trustworthy. I mean, I couldn't believe the progress that she made in that short amount of time. And because
Right.
it was true, like by all appearances, when we first saw her, we thought, oh, wow, that's a dog with a bleak future. And she ended up getting adopted out. She's a great dog. She's a great pet dog now. She's off leash trained. She's wonderful. Just needed that extra time and that extra attention. And it's really brutal because, as a shelter director, or as a somebody who makes that call at the shelter, you often feel like the angel of death. You're like, which ones do I pick that have the least likely odds of success? Is it the dog that's been here for 2 years? In most cases, yeah. And that's the decision that you're faced with, and it's terrible. So it's a really frustrating situation, right? And we've got these situations where, like, if we just had enough time, if we just had enough resources, we could help a lot of those dogs that we think are doomed, but actually aren't. But the reality of it right now is there's just not a lot of resources for those dogs, and no kill shelters deal with that every bit as much as your whatever you want to call them, open intake, high kill shelters are. And they're all making that same decision one way or the other, right? It's just one can make it faster than the other in a lot of times. And that term warehousing dogs is really the big problem, right? Because it boils down to the population issue. We just have too many damn dogs and cats. There's just too many. And you know, if we had a real no-kill situation, it would mean that we could spend weeks and months rehabilitating every dog and cat who needs it. But currently, it's just not our reality. So, um, so yeah, I love helping animals with special needs, but that's the other, like, that's the problem you run into there too, right? Like, okay, so I spent, a month rehabilitating Mona. How many dogs could I have basic trained and adopted out in that amount of time? That I prioritized Mona over those dogs, and I'm not sorry for it. But at the same time, you know, I mean, could I have worked 10 dogs in that amount of time and sent them off to good homes? So you're also dealing with that balance too.
That's an impossible question. I think that's the question I wrestled with in my book 100 Dogs with Gayla, because I had her for almost a year, nearly a year, and it was killing me because all I could think about was all the dogs I wasn't helping because
Yeah.
I had her. But then the idea of, and it was brought up, of euthanizing her, that was impossible. That was impossible for me. So it's just a really, really hard situation. In a perfect world, we do have time for these animals, but to me, the shelters have to look at that in terms of what's the shelter of the future look like? Because it isn't what it is right now, because that is not working. And too many dogs come into a shelter adoptable and then never leave because they become unadoptable because they live in a shelter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's we're setting them up to fail. And the way that we build shelters and stuff, and we'll talk about our ideal situation at the end of this
Mm-hmm.
too, just to end on an up note. But yeah, like that's the thing, right? Like the way that we even build shelters is wrong right now. Lining dogs up in cages in a row so they can all hear each other barking. And develop, boundary aggression because they're so frustrated. People walking past their cages, other people, other dogs, etc., every day over and over again, and then wondering why they jump the fence in the backyard and bite the neighbor when they're out on a jog, and it's like, well, we've kind of trained them to do that. So the way that we build shelters is a problem. And and the fact that we're just constantly living in a state of choosing the least of all evils. Like,
True.
okay, do we save this one dog with special needs, or do we try to save 5 or 10 in that time? And the thing is that the dog with the special needs is important too, because those are our examples that teach us that we can work with dogs who aren't perfect out of the gates, and that we can save them and be patient with them. And they have the most to teach us as humans too, in my opinion. They make us better people. And I think that's really important. But we also have this issue of like, but then these other 10 dogs are awesome and they deserve a chance too. And they cost less time and less money and less everything just to get them out in the world. So yeah, it's super frustrating. We're having the debate over which ones are okay to kill, instead of the discussion about why it's necessary in the first place a lot of the time. And that makes me crazy.
Mm-hmm.
So what about the shelters who don't claim no kill approach? Are they bad? And I think we've kind of already answered this, but I mean, what do you think, Cara? Like, were the shelters that you visited on your trip filled with bad people or good people?
Oh gosh, the most heroic people I've ever met. I'm astounded. I mean, rarely did I meet, of all those shelters, it's very rare that that I met anybody who I wouldn't call a hero. There were just so many people that were doing everything they can, sacrificing personal lives and personal fortunes and everything for a job that pays them very little and
Yeah.
is incredibly emotionally draining and uh, just unbelievable people who can do that. They're just unbelievable to me. So yeah, the shelter the shelter staff are, they're frontline workers, I guess,
They
in
are.
this war that it's become in trying to save dogs.
Yeah. You mentioned one lady in your book who's basically running an entire shelter all on her own after the volunteers and the staff, like, basically just ditch the place because there was a bunch of drama that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think about her a lot because I've known quite a few versions of her,
Yes.
in my times in shelters. And, it's that person that sticks even when they're mad, at the director, and they're mad at the city, or they're mad at, the fact that they're not allowed to put beds in their kennels, or give the dogs toys, or, anything, because I know you give the example in your book because they'll clog the drains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, screw you, build better drains. Like,
Right.
seriously, right? But then also, there's other risks that these people overseeing shelters seem to feel take precedence over the sanity of the animals in their care, which is why, like, one shelter south of where I live won't allow any of the dogs to have toys or anything like that. And I brought them up on previous episodes too. Like, their staff is wonderful, and that they give their dogs toys, and they get the swimming pools out, and they do all the things they're not supposed to until there's about 1 to 2 weeks before they think they're about to get audited, and then they pick it all up and they hide it.
One solution.
But it's maddening, but that lady in your book, I mean, kudos to her, because I should have written down her name. What was her, do you remember her name?
She's still um doing her, I mean, she's still doing her thing because and actually that shelter has made a big turnaround, but I've seen this same drama, like you said, play out again and again and again, and it's frustrating. And I say this to so many of my rescue friends. It's people, if the people would just, like, get over themselves, then we could save more dogs. And that's what it comes down to again and again, is we let personal agendas and our feelings and whatever get in the way of saving these animals. And it's got to be about the animals. So you have to be tactful. One woman that I wrote about in the book, Laura, who was going into this shelter that at the time, and it has since improved, thank goodness, at the time was just one of the saddest places I've ever been. And she was doing what she could, but she was not making a stink, because she knew if she made a stink, then she wouldn't be able to get in there anymore to help those dogs. So she just
Yeah.
had to deal with what she had. And then another person that I worked with, she actually did make a stink about a dog pound that had a distemper outbreak. And she told the dog catchers that, and they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to sanitize. They didn't care. They obviously never had done any kind of like vaccine on intake. That's not something that any dog pound, most dog pounds don't do. But anyway, they weren't concerned about it, and they didn't care about it. But she wouldn't shut up about it. She went to the mayor about it, and the result was the shelter still doesn't do any kind of vaccination on intake. They never did sanitize that place, and she's no longer allowed to go in there and pull dogs. So she
Mm.
lost her privileges, and so no one was going in there for a long time, almost a year. Now there is someone going in, but because she spoke up. So that's a really hard place to be for a shelter worker. Like
It is.
you have to, or volunteer too. You have
Mm.
to stomach some really crappy crap,
Yeah,
because
you
the
really
dogs
do.
matter, and your presence there matters, and you can't jeopardize that. So it's a tightrope you got to walk.
Yeah, I've actually lived this dream personally. I volunteered at a shelter a long time ago in North Houston that had an extremely corrupt shelter director who would kill dogs to punish people that she didn't like. So if a volunteer pissed her off, or if an employee pissed her off, she'd kill her favorite dog. And I saw dogs being euthanized for no reason at all, while kennels were empty and rescues and fosters were offering to take those dogs into their programs. And the director just refused them all. She wouldn't work with anybody. She thought she knew best, and she was just honestly just a vindictive bitch. And I was up there as a trainer, so I was trying to work with troubled dogs and stuff. I worked with one in particular named Beetlejuice, who was a little hairy dog, just perfectly normal little dog, who had been returned from a family who had a dachshund who attacked Beetlejuice. And I talked to the family personally, and they were like, yeah, it was our dog, but we had to return him because obviously our dog has issues, and we need to work on those before we bring another dog in. Totally understandable. Nothing wrong with Beetlejuice. Wasn't his fault. So another shelter volunteer stepped up to pull the dog, and she had done something that made the director mad, and she got there that day, started her shift, and by the time she was done with her shift, even though they knew that she was planning to take the dog home, they had pulled him and killed him. So we were all very angry, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, right? And so I was a volunteer there. I didn't make my living working there, and so I drafted a letter to the city, and I got involved with the other volunteer group that was trying to organize outside the shelter. And we laid out a proposal. They voted me as their speaker, and I just basically went to the city and I proposed a new plan for the shelter. And I tried to draw the city's attention to what was actually going on in their shelter. And I made sure to highlight things like how that would reflect on them. And, how there's really no excuse to not create a foster program because they're largely free if people are offering to pay for the food and everything, which this entire organization of fairly wealthy volunteers was offering to do. And I ended up getting involved, working with the up and coming chief of police, who was the sitting chief of police at the time. And he was kind of tasked with handling the issue, even though he wasn't really all that into it. He didn't feel like it was all that important. But I quickly realized that it was less about doing what was right for him in his mind, and more about how it could be played as a political card. So I just started appealing to that side for him. And, speaking politician at that point, and I made sure to highlight how a functioning shelter would be a feather in his cap when it came time to vote, and that would probably secure his seat because people love dogs. And, who doesn't love dogs? I mean, I would have told him that Beyonce was going to dedicate her next song to him. That would have made a difference, but it didn't have to lie because what I was telling him was absolutely true. So in the end, we actually got what we wanted. So it's a happy ending to this particular story. It doesn't always work out that way, but I think that the main thing to really take away from it is, we got a new director. We got more play yards. We got more than we actually thought we would. We got a foster program, green light to work with our shelters and rescues, everything we wanted. We even got more money out of the deal. And 2 years time, the shelter reached no kill status. And this is a shelter that was easily killing 60% of the dogs that came in. So, the people that worked at that shelter weren't bad people, though. They were led by a bad director. So to your point of leadership, right? Like that's key. And they weren't, that leader wasn't making the case to the city that she should have been making to make that shelter a good one. And I was in a unique position in that my paycheck wasn't on the line if I said something. Worst case scenario, they kick me out and I go volunteer at a different shelter. Screw them. But that allowed me the power in this unique way that volunteers have, this singularly powerful thing that volunteers can do that a lot of shelter workers can't, because shelter workers are relying on that paycheck, and it is easy to get shit canned at a shelter, if you say the wrong things, especially when you're working under a nightmare, dictator. And so, it was really rewarding after the fact to watch shelter staff returning to their jobs with like this renewed vigor and hope that like this had actually become a place that they could work at again. And it was a really neat experience to go through that. I literally I moved from Houston to Austin almost immediately after that. So I literally like was part of that whole process. And then I was like, it was nice knowing you guys. But, it can happen, if you've got a tactical approach, a respectful approach.
Yeah, that's the key. What you did is the key, coming into it with like, here's why it's beneficial politically. Here's why it's beneficial financially. And financially is usually the biggest one, and you come at it that way versus you're bad and you shouldn't be doing this, which is usually, usually it's somebody's mad and whatever. But if you take a step back and you look at the situation, and like, for instance, the distemper situation. So if you don't give these animals a $3 vaccine when they arrive at your shelter, even though you don't know if they've had it or whatever, like for whatever reason, if you just give everybody this little vaccine, you'll never have distemper probably ever in your shelter. Or you can just continue to go on and not spend that money. And then when you do get distemper and you have to euthanize half your population and the public is angry and they no longer donate and they no longer want to come there to adopt or volunteer, now you've just, what have you done? Like, instead of the little investment, $3 for a vaccine for every dog walking in the door. And too many places, literally, I have at least 3 I can think of top of my head that's exactly how they finally started using distemper vaccine, when somebody could have laid it out for them early on
Yeah,
and
the
they could have
math is
avoided
pretty
all of that.
straightforward, right? Like, costs more
Yeah,
to euthanize a dog than it does to prevent the distemper from taking
right.
over.
Those drugs are expensive, those euthanization drugs.
They
Very
sure are,
expensive.
especially as dogs become more resilient to them because of the way that we make our dog food. And a lot of dog food has euthanized animals, meat used in it, which,
Wow, I didn't know that.
yeah, which ups their resistance to the euthanasia
Wow.
drug. So as time goes by, dogs that are being euthanized in shelters and cats become more and more resilient to the drug itself. So they
Wow.
require more of it. Yeah.
Mm,
So, because they don't regulate the meat that goes into a lot of dog foods, and
right.
most shelter animals haven't eaten premium dog food, so they're getting by on. That's why I always dog out. I make sure to shout out to Alpo every episode now to make sure that they know that they're terrible and horrible, and it's my quest to put Alpo out of business. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy that somebody just need to do the math problem, right? And appeal to what interests those people. If you're talking to politicians, appeal to the political side of things. You have to, if you want somebody to do something, you have to tell them why it'll benefit them to do it, and you have to
Exactly.
set some of your own agenda aside, even though you're damn right for being pissed off. But you do have to. I mean, that's just the nature of rescue in general, right? Like, if you want to, bring change to anybody, uh, the wrong way to go about it is to go, up to a guy beating his dog and tell him he's a piece of shit. The right way to go about it would be to go and have an actual conversation with him, and maybe even teach him that, he doesn't have to do that, and that, he could literally teach his dog to listen to him through hand signals without ever having to say a word. And how cool would that make him look? A lot more effective than telling him that he's an abusive asshat, which, maybe he is, but maybe he could stop being one if you gave him a chance.
Right.
So yeah, anyway, like we said before too, high kill shelters are typically open admission, which means they have to take all of those animals in that come to them, versus a lot of no-kill rescues and shelters are independently owned, and they don't necessarily have to take in animals. We see that here at Awesome Pets Alive. By all accounts, you go to the shelter there, and it looks like a typical city shelter. It's not fancy at all. It's a depressing place. But they actually pull dogs from other shelters and into their facility, and then they adopt those dogs out. They are not the city shelter, so you can't drive your found dog to their shelter and turn them in. And that's how we define that open admission term. And if you go to a city shelter or a pound, they are typically the open admission. So any dog that comes in, any cat that comes in, any animal really in general, that's what that means. So that results in a lot more dogs, right? Okay. So in conclusion, before we depress ourselves into a stupor, so we know shelters can take on a no-kill approach by killing as few animals as possible with the resources that they have available to them. But only those with a 10% or less kill rate are allowed to market themselves as no kill. And this does mean that there is a concerted effort in reducing the kill rate at the shelter. But it doesn't necessarily define the quality of care the animals receive, right? That can vary largely. And this is determined first by resources available, like funding, facilities, people, so on. Some high kill shelters are trying their best, and some aren't trying very much at all, and the situation varies. The only way to know for sure is by getting involved. So a lack of no-kill status can actually serve as a flag for which shelters clearly need a lot more support. So if you're looking to volunteer somewhere, don't necessarily cherry pick just the no kill labeled shelters either and assume that the other ones are bad, because that's not the case usually. Usually those are the shelter workers that need the most. If your local shelter doesn't market themselves as no kill, don't rush to that judgment. It's also important for us to look deeply into no-kill shelters and make sure that they are adopting out dogs that are safe family pets. They aren't sustaining environments that traumatize and neglect the animals in their care. And that can be a very delicate balance for many. Losing that no-kill badge can seriously compromise their funding and public support. And so that can create some compromised decisions. And, we need to ask them what they need to do their jobs well. And if that means pressuring politicians in our area to do better, then we know that we as volunteers hold a unique power and that our jobs aren't on the line if we speak out. So what is it, Winnie? It's a plastic bag on the door. It's very scary. She's going to let it know that she's protecting it. You hear her growling. So, Cara, let's talk ideal situations. In your opinion, how do we put a stop to needlessly killing animals in shelters? What's the answer?
Wow, that is a really big question. Well, it's varies state by state, but first of all, you have to have a shelter system of some sort, and there does not exist a shelter system of some sort in too many places. They're dependent on, nonprofits that pop up and go away and end up becoming hoarding cases, and sometimes all over the place. So, but you put that piece aside. I believe that shelters of the future don't warehouse dogs. They are a foster system. I think the pandemic kind of showed us exactly how this could work. When we were emptying out shelters, everyone was fostering, right? That was super awesome. And so it showed that. And that's where the dog is going to be its best self. No dog in a shelter, even a really good shelter, is going to be its best self, because it's a stressful environment no matter what we do, however we create it. When you put a whole bunch of dogs who don't know each other, who are unsure, who are maybe lost, who are maybe have been through trauma or unhealthy, and you put them all in a building together, it doesn't matter what kind of walls you have, that's not a good situation, and they're going to be stressed, and it's going to come out in all different kinds of ways. So to my mind, like in the future, what happens is when a dog is found and an animal control officer or a good Samaritan brings it into the shelter, it stays there long enough to be assessed medically and behaviorally, and to have its chip checked, because every dog is chipped in my future world also.
Yeah.
And then if that dog, still needs shelter, then it's taken to a foster home and it's fostered until it's ready to be adopted. And then the shelter becomes an assessment center, a medical facility, an adoption center where people would come to, meet their dog there, and they would, and to me, that would be like the perfect setting. But first you got to get the number of dogs coming in general down, and that's going to take a concerted effort as far as spay, neuter, microchipping. There's so many things, just educating people so that we can get the intake number down to begin with. But seeing what happened at the pandemic thing, that was amazing to me. And the other way that we get the intake number down is by more people choosing to adopt and to rescue. And Kim Cavan in her book, The Dog Merchants, throws out a beautiful term, a number, and I'm going to get it wrong, but it's somewhere around a third. If like a third of the people who are now choosing to buy a dog instead chose to rescue a dog, our shelters would be literally emptied tomorrow if that happened. And to me, that's like a huge, huge thing. So if more people were to choose to adopt or rescue than to buy a dog, we could end this problem. And then we could have the shelter that I imagined, where they just come in to be assessed and then they go to a foster home. Because you're always going to have a need for shelter, because there's going to be extenuating circumstances where people die or get sick or have some kind of tragedy, or it happens. It's going to happen. But in the future, I don't see us having what we have now.
Yeah,
and I
me
think
neither.
This is a completely fixable problem, and the pandemic demonstrated it. And it's just a matter of awareness and education, and doing a better job with the animals we have now, so that when they do get adopted, people say, oh wow, your dog is so great, where did you get it? And you say you rescued it, versus letting dogs be adopted out who aren't perfect or aren't great pets. So we have to do a better job with the dogs we have now, and we have to get the public to choose to rescue.
Yeah.
And we'd be right on the road. Wouldn't
Yeah,
take
and
much.
I think it really does boil down to addressing overpopulation, and we can, the thing is that we want to dream all day about what we could do. And I think you're absolutely right. That's the future of sheltering. And we are making progress towards that. We could do that much faster if we handled the overpopulation issue, which, like you said, boils down to adopting and fostering dogs instead of buying them. And, until then, like until we address the issue of puppy mills and pet stores and backyard breeders and dog fighters, there's gonna be too many animals and there's gonna be this uphill battle. And we can adopt our way out of this, but not at the rate that we would need to continue it in any kind of successful way without addressing those other things first too. So I think another key to this is creating legislation that absolutely bans people from selling animals in pet stores, and that has stricter consequences for people who backyard breed and puppy mill breed. And in a lot of places it's still perfectly legal to go to the flea market and buy a dog, or go to the mall and buy a dog. And we've seen one of the reasons why Austin has reached the 98% number that it has largely to do with the fact that they no longer allow pet stores in the city. They don't allow people to sell dogs on the side of the road. They don't allow you to chain a dog up in your yard and leave them there. They don't allow you to put them in the back of your truck. All that stuff here is illegal. You can get fined for it at the very least, and you should, right? Those are things we shouldn't be allowed to do. So I think we need to control the output a little bit better as well. And we see things like this, and mandatory microchipping and mandatory spay and neuter in countries that have overcome their homeless pet population issue, which happens now. That's a thing that has happened in whole countries, which is really cool. Like if we look at the Netherlands, they are a perfect example of a country who has taken these exact actions to control their output of animals, which has therein resulted in a reasonable number of people adopting dogs and eradicating the overpopulation issue altogether. And like to your point, if you find an animal, they're probably microchipped. So people are more likely to pick them up, take them to the shelter, or take them to the vet, have them scanned, get them back home. The dog usually never has to see a shelter, which, in this ideal world of ours, creates a shelter that's entirely based on public need and aid, like mutual aid type services. So imagine a shelter being a place that, like, if you fell on financial hard times, or if somebody gets sick or somebody dies, the animal has a temporary place to go before that they can be rehomed. And to your point, a foster program that is aimed at mutual aid for people in your community over this, just keeping them out of shelters, and this constant uphill battle of trying to lower those numbers, and absolutely keeping those dogs a lot more sane in the process, never having to stick them in the confines of a kennel where they're going to go stir crazy and develop all kinds of potentially bad habits in the process. So I think this issue is as much an animal issue as it is a people issue too. And that's really important, because a lot of people don't care so much about animals. They're not like us. I'll take dogs over humans most days, but there's a lot of people who feel differently, and I understand that. But our animal care workers are dropping dead at ridiculous rates, higher suicide rates than police officers. Veterinarians are dying left and right. Shelter workers are depressed, and rightfully so. They do terrible hard work. And I've known of 3 personally that have committed suicide. So it's a heartbreaking and dangerous job. And none of us really make it out unscathed, and some of us die. So it's a human interest issue as much as it is an animal interest issue. What we do to our animals, we also do to ourselves. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, when we're thinking about our society as a whole. We're modeling this for our children. And I think it makes a bigger impact than people think it does. So, people created domesticated dogs and cats, And in order to end the suffering brought on by overbreeding them, we need to start following the lead of countries like the Netherlands and start treating this issue with the priority that humans' best friend deserves and that humans deserve. Um, so yeah, that's my soapbox on shelters. Uh, and perhaps the shelters of the future do look like something completely different than what we see now. And I would love to see that. And to your point, if everybody did something tomorrow, it would be a non-issue like that. And if a fraction of society just picked up and did more, I mean, it would take us, what, 1 to 2 years to wipe it out entirely, right? To pass the legislation that we needed to support that long-term effect and to make the world a better place for humans and animals alike. So that's where I go to save my sanity, is I just think of that world over and over again. At each dog that we foster, every dog that we pull from the shelter, every time I go, I'm like, eventually this is not going to be the problem that it is today. And that gives me sanity, because, we've seen the numbers go from reported numbers, 7 million in
Yeah.
2017, 2018. I have it written down here somewhere. And down to 2 million so far this year, live intakes.
Yeah.
So I think that is a sign of real progress. It's just still a really big number.
And it's just the last bit, I feel like the people who came before us, starting like 20 years ago, they've worked and worked and worked, and they've moved the needle so far, and we're getting there, and we're getting so close to the end. But this last push is going to be the hardest part. It's going to be as hard as all of the rest, because what, the easy stuff, the low hanging fruit's been done. Now's the hard part. Now's when we have to do more, and we can. And to me, I'm so hopeful, because I clearly can see how we fix this. It's not an unfixable problem. There are such simple answers to my mind. It's just making them happen that's going to be a challenge, because like you said at the very beginning, there's no system, there's nobody auditing, there's no definitions, there's no, like, without any kind of framework, it's very hard to make this to put universal solutions in everywhere. It's going to take good leadership in each and every place, and dealing with their particular issues. But it can happen. It can totally happen. And we're a dog loving nation. We are an animal loving nation. We will get this. We will get there. I totally believe it.
And everybody has something that they can do too, whether or not you can go out and adopt or foster a dog, which is great if you can, but also, maybe you don't have the time to volunteer in a shelter, but you have administrative time to support a local rescue or shelter, or maybe you have just extra funds to donate, or, I know in your book, you give a nice long list of things that, at the back of it, things that people can do to be active, and you give a list of the shelters on your tour too, in case somebody wants to support them. But the things that people can do are endless. If you're into marketing, you can help market. If you like social media, you can help post on social media. If you're into behavior stuff like I am, you can donate your time, or even just your phone calls, and the list goes on. Even if you're just doing something as simple as shopping on Amazon, you can use Amazon Smile, and a portion of that goes to the shelter of your choice. So, as long as it's on their list, and if your favorite rescue or shelter isn't, tell them to get on there, and they make money off of that, much needed funds. So, it's an endless number of things that we can do to help. Can write a book like Cara, and and get the word out to more people. And that's really important, being a voice for those who don't have a voice. And again, it helps us all. It helps people, it helps animals. It's just all around important. So it doesn't have to be this way if we all do our part. All right, so let's see. Yeah, I guess the main thing that I want to leave everybody with on this particular episode is the fundamental answer to helping our pets starts with making less of them, and adopting the ones, taking care of the ones that we already have. So, and then anybody who wants to have the breeding for the betterment of the breed discussion with me can have that with me after we take care of this particular issue. I'd be happy to debate that sometime in our glorious future when our shelters are not overflowing with homeless dogs. Send me your hate mail. I'm sure I'll get some from a few
I'm looking
breeders.
forward to that day when we have to go to a breeder to buy a dog because we can't get a dog. There aren't any at the shelter. I can't wait for that day because there's
It should
lots of
be a
breeds I'm really curious about.
it should be a privilege to have a dog and a cat. It
Mhm.
shouldn't be this burden that our society is constantly trying to take care of. You know, there's so many people who treat them like they are uh, disposable, you know,
Right.
because there's just so many. And they think, well, this one's no good. I'm going to go on to the next one or whatever. We need to fix the entire way that we look at our pets and our animals. There needs to be a fundamental shift in how we view, you know, these members of our family and how we stick by them in their old age as well. But you know, that I think also starts with the issues of scarcity. We need to have a little bit of a scarcity issue. I think it'd be good for our dogs and cats to be in high demand.
Yep.
All right, so Cara, that's pretty much all I got for today. You got anything else you want to add?
No, I think we've covered so much of it, but all I would add is be patient with your animals. Those of you who have adopted during the pandemic and life is gonna change. Our life is gonna come back. I think many of us think this is the way it's gonna be forever, but we are gonna resume the world a little different, but as we knew it. And already, as you mentioned earlier, we're feeling the effects of people, who are going back to work, and you need to be patient and reach out and ask for help, and work with
Start
it,
kennel
work with
training
them.
right now. For those of you listening who have foster dogs or newly adopted dogs or dogs that have never been in a kennel this whole pandemic, dogs need naps during the day. Use your nap time as kennel time. Kennel train your dog now. And
Right.
so that you can go to work without your dog tearing up your house. That's my pro tip for the day. Um, any let's see, you want to share where we can find your wonderful books?
Yeah, so I have too many sites, so I'm gonna just give the biggest one. If you just go to Cara Writes, Cara, I'm a C, not a K, CaraWrites.com, you'll find all links to everything, because I do have a blog and I am the co-founder of Who Will Let the Dogs Out, which is a nonprofit initiative to raise awareness and funds for shelter dogs. And so that site is whowillletthedogs.out.org. But all of these things you can find via Cara Rights. But on that site, you can find out about the shelters that I have visited, the ones I've gone to since the book came out. And we are getting ready to go on a big trip in January for 2 weeks. We're going to be in North Carolina, Georgia, Florida for the bulk of the time, and then back up through Alabama and Tennessee on the way home. So we're going to be hitting a whole bunch of shelters in January to try to raise awareness and raise resources. And if you know of a shelter or a rescue or a dog pound that we should see in one of those states, I'd love to hear from you. We're still putting our itinerary together. So, yeah, so find me. I would love to talk more about any of these issues. And if you need any help figuring out how you can be a part of the solution, I am more than happy to point you in that direction. And that's the whole purpose of Who Will Let the Dogs Out. So if you reach out to me via that or my website, I'm happy to help any way I can.
Awesome. Awesome. And any specific rescues or shelters you want to give a shout out to?
Oh, my favorite shelter, which is it's a rescue that just started this past January and already has saved, I want to say, 100 animals out of the mostly out of the dog pounds of Tennessee. It's in Western Tennessee and it's called Halfway Home Animal Rescue Inc. HHAR. You can find them on Facebook, but they do have a website too. And they don't have a building yet, but they are mighty. I mean, they are doing this through fosters and using the founder Amber's garage and all the little buildings that her husband can put together. But they are doing the hardest job. They're going into the pounds and pulling dogs and saving them before they're killed. And they're one of the only rescues doing that. So my heart goes out to them. I think they're fabulous, and I can't say enough good about them. So they're one, and then I have to give a shout out to my rescue, Operation Paws for Homes, because I foster for them, and Who Will Let the Dogs Out is run through them. And they are an all-breed rescue based in Alexandria, Virginia, but we have foster homes and adopters in Maryland, D.C., Virginia, South Central PA. We even have a few, I think, in Delaware. So we're everywhere, and that's ophrescue.org. So that's an awesome organization, and they have saved, through this whole pandemic, they've been bringing up dogs almost every week, literally between 50 and 100 dogs from really dire situations down south. So great organization.
Amazing. So go check them out if you're looking for a great organization to support. Um, for references on this episode, check out farfetchedpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at farfetchedpod. Follow me on Twitter at crystal_Dunn or at farfetch. I don't know. It's one of those. I'm not good at Twitter. It's mostly just pictures of my dog on there, which is good. That's what we need more of. More pictures of Brew and Winnie. Listen to future and past episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And feel free to drop me a line about future topics or questions at farfetchpod@gmail.com. Yeah, that's pretty much it. New episodes are uploaded on the 5th of every month. Thanks for joining me, Cara. I really appreciate it.
Thanks
You've
for
been
having
fabulous. Me. I love what you're doing. Super awesome. Keep it up.
me.
And let me know if you need to drink a glass of wine. Until next time, I'm Crystal Dunn. Tell your dog